The other maids quit within a week. The building staff said he was untouchable, ice cold, a man who hadn't smiled in years. But Caroline had been living in his penthouse for 3 months, and she had seen him laugh, had seen him cook soup and buy peonies and look at her like she was something worth protecting. Which is why when Baek Do-hyun finally said the words out loud, "You know you want this," the most terrifying part wasn't that he said it. It was that somewhere behind that locked study door, 8 men who controlled the underworld of 3 continents were about to make her the most dangerous secret he'd ever kept. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Caroline Davis arrived in Seoul on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases, a job offer printed on agency letterhead, and the particular kind of determination that only comes from starting completely over. Chicago had taken too much from her. A relationship that left her hollowed out, a lease she couldn't afford alone, a city that suddenly felt like a wound she was living inside. Seoul was distance. Seoul was different. Seoul, she told herself on the 14-hour flight, was just a job. The agency had placed her as a household manager for a luxury penthouse on the 42nd floor of a building in Gangnam, so tall it seemed to puncture the clouds. The listing described the resident as a private businessman, 60, widower, no children, rarely home, requiring discretion above all else. Good. She didn't want conversation. She wanted work, income, and the clean anonymity of being a foreigner in a foreign city where nobody knew her name or her history. The first time she saw Baek Do-hyun, she almost didn't notice him. He moved through his own home like a shadow, silent and contained, dressed entirely in charcoal and black. He was tall for a Korean man of his generation. Sharp cheekbones. Silver hair that he wore brushed back from his forehead with the kind of effortless authority that can't be bought or learned. He glanced at her once when Mrs. Cho, the building manager, introduced them. A single look, cool and assessing, and then he was gone, disappearing through the heavy double doors of his private study without another word. Good, Caroline thought again. She was just the help. The penthouse itself was almost aggressively beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline. Marble floors the color of storm clouds. Art she couldn't name, but suspected cost more than her parents' house in Chicago. She was given her own room on the service wing, smaller than the rest but comfortable, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made her chest ache with something she couldn't quite name. The first week was uneventful. Baek Do-hyun came and went at hours that made no sense. Sometimes he returned at 3 a.m., and she'd hear the elevator chime in the corridor. Sometimes he was already gone before she woke at 6. He never addressed her directly. When he needed something communicated to household staff, he relayed it through Mrs. Cho's daily notes left on the kitchen counter in precise, elegant Korean script that the translation app on Caroline's phone rendered imperfectly but adequately. She cleaned his study only when he was away, and even then she moved carefully, as if the room had a memory and might report her back to him. The desk was obsessively ordered. No photographs except one. A woman, Korean, elegant, laughing at something just outside the frame. His wife, Caroline assumed. Gone some years based on the slight yellowing at the photograph's edge and the way the frame had been positioned so that it faced the window rather than the door, like something private rather than displayed. She didn't linger. She dusted, straightened, and left. 3 weeks in, something shifted. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening when Caroline was in the kitchen making herself tea before bed, and Baek Do-hyun walked in unexpectedly, still in his coat, looking like he'd forgotten the apartment had other people in it. They both stopped. The silence was the particular kind that happens when 2 people are suddenly aware of each other in a way they weren't before. "I didn't know you were still awake," he said. His English was accented but precise, each word chosen with the deliberateness of a man who never spoke carelessly. Caroline blinked. It was the first full sentence he'd ever directed at her. "I was just making tea. I'll get out of your way." He held up one hand slightly, a gesture that stopped her without commanding her. "Sit. I don't require the kitchen." He poured himself a glass of water, drank it standing at the counter, and then left. 2 minutes, total. But Caroline sat with her tea for a long time afterward, aware that something small had changed, the way a single stone dropped into still water changes the entire surface. A few days later, he did it again. Walked into a room she was in, paused, and instead of leaving, stayed. This time it was the living room, late afternoon light cutting gold across the floors. She was arranging fresh flowers from the morning delivery, and he stood by the window looking out at the city below with his hands clasped behind his back. And for 20 minutes neither of them spoke, and somehow it wasn't awkward. It was almost companionable, like two people who'd silently agreed that silence didn't require filling. When he finally spoke, he said, "Those are peonies." She looked at the flowers in her hands. "Yes, Mrs. Cho's standing order is orchids, but I changed it. I hope that's all right. Orchids in this light look like they're trying too hard." He turned from the window then and looked at her. Really looked at her, not the quick assessing glance from the first day, but something slower, more deliberate. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter, more private. "You have opinions," he said. She met his gaze. "I do." Baek Do-hyun notices her, and they begin talking, but she remains unaware that she is talking to Korean's biggest drug lord. Can he afford to let feelings come in despite the nature of his world? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. He nodded once as if she'd confirmed something he was still deciding whether to find interesting or inconvenient. Then he left for dinner or a meeting or wherever men like Baek Do-hyun went in the evenings when the city's legitimate face turned toward its shadow side. Caroline didn't know, then, what that shadow looked like. She would find out, but not yet. The weeks accumulated. Seoul autumn arrived and turned the city amber and rust, and Caroline found herself settling into something she hadn't expected. Not just a routine, but a kind of quiet contentment. She explored the neighborhood on her days off, found a coffee shop 3 blocks away where the owner spoke enough English to chat, discovered that she had a talent for making the kind of Korean home-cooked meals she'd looked up online, and that Baek Do-hyun, who rarely ate at home, had begun doing so with increasing frequency. He never said why. He'd just appear at the kitchen table around dinner time, still in his business clothes, jacket removed, sleeves rolled to the forearm, reading documents from a leather folder while she cooked. She learned he didn't talk while he read. She learned he took his rice firm and his soup without too much salt. She learned that he drank 1 glass of red wine with dinner and then stopped, and that he had the particular self-discipline of a man who'd trained himself out of every indulgence that could become a vulnerability. She didn't know yet that that discipline was survival. One evening, she burned the bottom of the doenjang jjigae she'd been attempting for the 3rd time and made a sound of pure frustration, and he looked up from his documents and said, with complete seriousness, "You're adding the pace too early." She stared at him. "You cook?" "I used to." His voice went somewhere briefly. "Before." He closed his folder. "Move the pot." He stood and came to the stove, not touching her, maintaining the careful distance of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and what it cost him, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. And he corrected her technique with a few quiet instructions, and the soup was right, and they ate dinner together for the first time without the pretense of accident or coincidence. It was the first of many. Caroline knew she was in trouble around the 6th week when she caught herself watching the elevator light in the lobby camera feed on her phone, tracking when he would return. She told herself it was professional attentiveness. She knew it was a lie. There was something about Baek Do-hyun that was becoming impossible to ignore. Not just the way he looked, though the way he looked at 60 was the kind of thing that made her reassess everything she'd assumed about age and attraction. It was the way he moved through the world as if the world had agreed in advance to accommodate him. The way he listened when she spoke, with a quality of attention that felt like being the only thing in the room that mattered. The way he remembered things she'd mentioned in passing, a song she'd said she liked playing quietly from somewhere in the penthouse the next morning, the brand of tea she preferred appearing in the cabinet without comment. Small things, deliberate things, things that meant he was paying attention. She told herself it was nothing, that he was just a private, self-contained man who had allowed her into the edges of his routine, and that she was misreading courtesy for something it wasn't. She was the help. He was a 60-year-old Korean businessman who probably had more zeros in his bank account than she'd ever see and moved in circles she'd never access, and had loved a woman once. The woman in the photograph, and that kind of love left marks that didn't invite replacements. She was still telling herself this when he saved her from the man in the elevator. It was a Thursday evening, early November. She was returning from her day off, still in her good coat, bag over one shoulder, when a man got into the elevator at the parking level. He was drunk, or close to it, dressed in the kind of expensive casual that meant money and the confidence that came with it. He looked at Caroline with the particular look she recognized across every culture, the one that calculated quickly and decided she was available. He said something in Korean she didn't understand. She looked away. He stepped closer. She put her bag between them and pressed the button for the 42nd floor again, even though she'd already pressed it, and the elevator was rising, and she was doing the rapid internal calculation of exits and responses when the doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer, and Baek Do-hyun was standing there. He was in his shirt sleeves, clearly just returned himself, and he took in the scene in under 2 seconds. Caroline's posture, the man behind her, the distance between them, that wasn't enough. Something in Baek Do-hyun's face went very still. He looked at the man and said something quiet in Korean, 4 or 5 words, and whatever he said made the man step back immediately, press the lobby button, and not look up once as the doors closed. Caroline exhaled slowly. What did you say to him? Baek Do-hyun's gaze came to her then, and there was something in it she hadn't seen before. A controlled heat. Something that had been awakened and was being very deliberately contained. I told him he was in the wrong building. She almost laughed from the adrenaline of it. That's all. His expression was steady. That was enough. She thanked him and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with her coat still on, aware that the evening had rearranged something between them, some invisible partition that had been maintaining a safe and appropriate distance, and that it had shifted, and that both of them knew it. The next day he was gone before she woke. But there were peonies on the kitchen counter. Not orchids. Peonies. Just the flowers. No note. No explanation. She stood in the morning light holding them for longer than was reasonable. She was falling. She knew it. She just didn't know yet how far the ground was. Falling for a man, old enough to be her grandfather. Does age matter, or does love hold no bounds? Would it be too late when she realizes that falling for him would be a death sentence? Hit that subscribe button and find out. The thing about Baek Do-hyun was that he never rushed anything. Whatever was developing between them, he let it develop at the pace of something that intended to last, slow and inevitable as the turn of a season. He didn't push. He didn't crowd. He simply made his presence felt, consistently, quietly, with a precision that she suspected he applied to everything he controlled, which was more than she knew. He started asking her about Chicago. Not the polite surface questions she'd gotten from the agency staff or the building manager, but real questions, curious ones, the kind that required real answers. What had she loved about it? What had she left behind? What she'd been running from, though he framed it more graciously than that. She found herself telling him things she hadn't expected to say. About her mother's church on the south side and the way the choir sounded on winter Sunday mornings. About the relationship that had taken 2 years of her life and returned nothing. About the particular loneliness of being a large, dark-skinned black woman in spaces that wanted you smaller, paler, quieter, and how she'd spent too many years complying and finally stopped. He listened. He didn't perform listening. He actually did it, with the same quality of attention that had been unnerving her for weeks now. When she finished, he said, "You shouldn't have had to choose between yourself and belonging. Those are not terms that deserve to be offered." She looked at him across the dinner table. "And you? What did you leave behind?" He was quiet for a moment. A different kind of quiet, one with weight in it. "I left behind the man I intended to be," he said. "A long time ago." She didn't ask what he meant. It felt like something that would take time to explain and more trust than they'd formally established, even if something between them had already quietly accumulated more than either would have named. What she didn't know was what happened behind the doors of his private study during the late-night calls, the ones that came in after midnight and lasted sometimes until dawn. What she didn't know was what the men who came to the building's private entrance on the first Tuesday of every month were there to discuss, or why they arrived in unmarked vehicles and left without ever being seen by the building's main security cameras. What she didn't know was that the import company whose name appeared on Baek Do-hyun's desk documents was a real company with real shipping routes that also served as the cleanest, most efficient international drug distribution operation in East Asia. She didn't know that Baek Do-hyun had built it from nothing at 32, grieving and cold, and deciding that a world that took his wife at 29 to a disease that money could have treated if there had been any money, that such a world owed him different rules. She didn't know that he had spent 3 decades being owed and collecting, or that the stillness she read as self-discipline was also the stillness of a man who had done things at which the world would not flinch, because the world never found out. She didn't know any of it. She only knew the man who remembered how to make doenjang jjigae and bought peonies, and listen like listening was something he'd been conserving for exactly the right person. The night it happened between them, the air shifted first. Caroline felt it at dinner, That particular quality of charged tension that sits in the space between two people who have been pretending not to notice each other for too long. He'd poured wine. She'd made galbi, her best attempt yet, and he'd eaten 2 helpings without comment, but with an expression she'd learned to translate as something beyond satisfaction. He was looking at her more tonight than usual. Not the quick glances. The full ones. When she stood to clear the table, he said, "Leave it." She looked at him. "Sit with me," he said. "Just sit." So she did. And they sat in the low light of the dining room with souls spread out through the floor-to-ceiling windows below them. And he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I don't say it carelessly." She felt her heart change rhythm. "You came here as a stranger," he continued, as if measuring each word before releasing it. "In my experience, this apartment has been a place where I exist, but do not live. You changed that. I am aware that the distance between our lives is significant. I am also aware that I am 60 years old and you are." He paused. "How old are you?" 34, she said. He nodded once. Then quietly, "You know you want this." It wasn't arrogant. It wasn't cruel. It came from somewhere honest, from a man who had learned to read rooms and people with the accuracy of someone whose survival once depended on it, and who was now using that skill not for power but for truth. Caroline's breath left her slowly. She could have denied it. She almost did. The sensible part of her, the Chicago part, the part that knew she was the help and he was the employer, and that this particular combination of emotions never ended cleanly, that part rose up and started to speak. But he was looking at her with those silver-edged eyes, with that quality of attention that felt like being the only thing in the world that mattered, and she said instead, "That doesn't mean it's a good idea." He said, "I know." And they sat with that for a long moment, the city below them glittering and indifferent, and then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his palm upward without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting weeks for exactly that, and she thought she felt something in him exhale that had been held for a very long time. They were careful with it. That was the word for what came after. Careful. He did not rush her. She did not rush herself. What developed between them was tender in a way that felt almost incongruous against the backdrop of a man who carried himself like a controlled detonation. But she was learning that was exactly what he was. Tremendous power, deliberately contained, deployed with precision. And what he chose to direct that precision toward, in the hours when the rest of his world fell away, was her. He took her to dinner in Insadong at a restaurant, so quiet it felt like being inside a secret. He walked beside her on the Han River on a Sunday afternoon with both hands in his pockets like a man relearning what it felt like to not be watching for threats. He sat with her in the kitchen at midnight when she couldn't sleep and talked about the wife in the photograph, Young-ah, dead at 29 of a treatable cancer, and how a grief like that either breaks you or transforms you, and that what it had transformed him into was not something he was proud of, but was something he had made peace with. "I made decisions," he said, "ones I can't undo. I built something that has kept me safe and kept others dependent on me for 28 years. He was looking at the table when he said it, not at her. Caroline waited. "I tell you this because you deserve honesty, not the details. The details are not something you need, but the shape of it. That I am not simply a businessman." She thought about the men who came on the first Tuesday of the month, the calls that lasted until dawn, the way certain people in the building looked at him, not with the deference reserved for wealth, but something older and more visceral than that. "Are you dangerous?" she asked. He looked at her then. "To you? Never. In this world? Yes. It should have ended there. Every reasonable instinct said it should have ended there. But what Caroline had learned over 34 years, in Chicago, in the church her mother raised her in the relationship that took everything and returned nothing, was that reasonable instincts were sometimes the architecture of the life you settled for rather than the life you chose. "I'm not running," she said. His jaw moved. Something worked through his expression that she read as relief and fear arriving simultaneously. "You should understand what that means before you say it. Tell me." "Not yet," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight I just want this." This was his hand finding hers across the table again. This was the particular piece of two people who had been separately alone for too long, finding in each other the specific warmth of being known. They had weeks of that. Good weeks. The best weeks Caroline could remember. She explored Seoul with increasing fluency, her Korean improving from agency-level functional to genuinely conversational, aided by the housekeeper Mrs. Kwan who found it charming and corrected her mercilessly and affectionately. She found a rhythm to her days that felt chosen rather than defaulted into. And in the evenings, More often than not, Baek Do-hyun came home. The only rule, unspoken, was that his study was his alone during business hours. When the study doors were closed, she did not enter. When he was on call, she did not approach. The private side of his life had a physical boundary, and she respected it without fully understanding why the boundary needed to exist or what exactly it was containing. She found out on a Wednesday in December. She had been trying to find a plumber's contact number. Mrs. Kwan had taken the day off. The number was in the household management folder she'd last seen near the printer in the hallway adjacent to the study, and the study doors were open, just slightly, not all the way, but not latched. She could hear voices inside. Multiple voices. Korean, formal, clipped. The particular cadence of a business meeting. She should have gone to find the folder elsewhere. She should have texted Mrs. Kwan. She should have done a great number of things other than what she did, which was stop and listen, and then, because the study door was not fully closed and she was standing 6 inches from the gap, look. 8 men were inside, all seated at the round meeting table Baek Do-hyun used for what she'd assumed were corporate gatherings. On the large screen behind him were maps she recognized now as shipping routes, and overlaid on those routes were numbers and columns she recognized as quantities and currencies. One of the men at the table she recognized from a photo she'd once seen on a news site. A face connected to a name connected to a cartel operation in 3 countries. Her brain moved slowly, assembling what she was seeing into something it didn't want to assemble. Baek Do-hyun was at the head of the table. He was not the man who taught her how to make soup or bought peonies or held her hand at midnight. He was something else, something entirely other, composed of authority so absolute that the 7 men around him were visibly arranged by proximity to his approval. He was speaking in the low, precise Korean of a man conducting a transaction that involved human lives as variables in a logistics problem. Caroline moved before she understood that she was moving. Her shoulder caught the door. It opened. The silence that fell inside the study was absolute and immediate and terrible. 7 faces turned toward her. And then Baek Do-hyun turned. And what she saw on his face in that single unguarded instant before the mask came down was the most frightening thing she had ever witnessed. Not anger, not fury, but horror. The particular horror of a man watching 2 worlds collide that he had spent every resource he possessed keeping separated. One of the men at the table, the one from the news photo, spoke in Korean. Sharp words. An instruction. 2 of the others were on their feet before he finished speaking. Baek Do-hyun said one word, also in Korean. Stop. They stopped. He looked at her across the room with an expression that had gone completely still and said, in English, go to your room and lock the door. Caroline, whose legs had forgotten how to work, said, I was looking for the. She stopped. The folder didn't matter anymore. Now, he said. His voice was low and absolute, and she recognized it now as the voice that made men stop what they were doing without question. She went. She heard the study doors close behind her. She heard voices rise briefly in Korean, rapid and intense, through the walls. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and understood, in the specific clarity that shock sometimes produces, exactly what she had walked into and exactly what Baek Do-hyun was. Not simply dangerous, as he'd warned her. The kind of dangerous that came with shipping routes and international contacts and men around a table who made decisions about quantities of things that destroyed lives. She sat there for 2 hours. The apartment was quiet again. She heard the elevator. The apartment going still. Then footsteps in the corridor. A knock at her door. Come in, she said, even though everything in her was afraid. He came in and stood in the doorway, jacket removed now. A man who looked his age in a way he rarely did, and said, there are things I need to tell you. She looked at him. You should have told me before I walked in. Yes. He sat on the chair across from her bed. Not close. The distance of a man who understood she might need it. And he told her. Not everything. But enough. The cartel. The operation. What it moved and where. How long. He told her in the quiet, precise way he did everything. Without decoration or excuse. Just the shape of a truth that had been waiting to become available to her since the first Tuesday of the month she'd noticed the unmarked cars. When he finished, she said, how many people? He understood what she was asking. Enough. She looked at the floor. The marble floor of the penthouse she'd been cleaning for 4 months. The penthouse paid for by this. I wanted, he said, and then stopped. The word cost him something. I wanted this part of my life to be separate from you. He looked at his hands. I built a wall around it. Not to deceive you, but to protect you. And myself. From what? From exactly what is happening right now. His voice was low. You looking at me and seeing what I am. The silence stretched. Then Caroline said, quietly, and if I hadn't opened that door, would you have told me? He met her eyes. Eventually. Yes. When I was certain. Certain of what? That you could bear it, he said. And that I could bear losing you if you couldn't. She didn't respond to that. There were things happening inside her chest that required more time than the conversation was allowing. Grief and anger and an ache for the simpler version of the last 4 months that didn't have this underneath it. I need time, she said. He nodded once. Take it. He left her alone. But the decision had already been made in the study by the man from the news photo, the one who spoke first when she appeared in the doorway, the one who had looked at her and seen not a problem that could be managed but a liability that needed to be addressed. He had said, after Baek Do-hyun sent her out, that this proved what he had been warning about for months, that their leader had developed an exposure, a weakness in the form of a foreign woman who now knew things that could undo all of them. He had proposed a solution. Baek Do-hyun had refused. The man had proposed it again, the following morning, in a different way. Not as a suggestion this time. As a condition. The terms the other cartel partners had agreed to when they sat at that table were clear. No exposures. No liabilities. No exceptions. The woman had seen the meeting. The woman had seen faces and maps, and heard what was said. The woman was either eliminated or Baek Do-hyun surrendered the operation. Everything he had built in 28 years, his territory, his contacts, his empire, to be divided among the men who now sat across from him with the particular patience of people who understood leverage. Choose, they said, her life or your empire. He sat at the head of his table in the empty penthouse study with his hands flat on its surface for a long time. They brought Caroline to the meeting the next afternoon. Not gently. She had been in the building's rooftop garden, a concession she negotiated with Mrs. Kwan on quiet afternoons, when 2 of the men from the previous meeting appeared with the kind of courtesy that wasn't courtesy at all and told her that Mr. Baek required her presence. She went with them because Baek Do-hyun had told her she was safe with him, and she was still operating inside that promise, still holding it against the evidence now accumulating around it. They brought her into the study. All 8 men were there again. She was put in a chair at the side of the table, not at it, the chair reserved for people being addressed. The man from the news photo was speaking in Korean, and someone was translating, a young man with careful eyes who rendered each sentence in flat English. You were not supposed to know anything. You know too much. These men have a rule. Those who know must be managed. He used that word carefully. Managed. Caroline looked at Baek Do-hyun across the table. He was looking back at her with the stillness she'd come to know, but now saw differently. Not self-discipline, not the containment of power, but the containment of grief so total it had to be held absolutely still, or it would break the room. The man from the news photo said something in Korean. The translator did not immediately translate it. He looked at Baek Do-hyun instead. Baek Do-hyun closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them, and his face was the face of the man who sat at the head of this table, the crime lord, the architect of 28 years of violence and control, and he picked up the gun that had been placed at the center of the table. The room went quiet in a different way, not the silence of a meeting, the silence of a verdict. Caroline looked at the gun in his hand. She did not look away from him. Do it, the man said. In English this time. Prove she is not what we say she is. Prove she is not the thing that makes you weak. Every person in the room was watching Baek Do-hyun. Baek Do-hyun was looking at Caroline. She said, quietly, so that only he could hear it, you told me you weren't going to let anyone hurt me. The gun in his hand. The room waiting. The empire he had built from ash and grief and 28 years of decisions that had taken him further from the man he'd intended to be. Caroline watching him with those eyes, not afraid, or not only afraid, but something else underneath the fear. Something that said, whatever you are, I have already seen it, and I chose you anyway, and I need to know if you are going to choose me back. His hand was steady. It was always steady. That was part of what made him what he was. He set the gun down on the table. The room shifted. The man from the news photo leaned forward. Baek Do-hyun said, in Korean, and the translator's voice came half a second later, you said my empire or her life. I choose her. All of it. You can have all of it. The silence that followed was the longest of Caroline's life. Then, quietly, the man said, you understand what you are giving up. I understand exactly what I am giving up, Baek Do-hyun said. And I understand exactly what I am keeping. What happened in the next hour was the methodical dismantling of 28 years of criminal architecture by the man who had built it. Baek Do-hyun transferred access codes, signed documents that had been prepared in advance, because these men had known from the beginning that there was always a version of this meeting that ended this way. He surrendered territory and contacts and the infrastructure of an empire, calmly, precisely, the same way he'd once built it. And when it was done and the men left, taking with them the sum total of what he'd been for 28 years, he sat in his study alone for a moment. Then he walked out and found Caroline standing in the corridor where she'd been permitted to wait, and he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something in him looked like it had been set down. Like something heavy had finally been placed on the floor after being carried for so long the body had forgotten what it felt like to stand without the weight. She crossed the hallway and put her arms around him. He stood very still for a moment, as if the gesture required translation. Then his arms came around her, and he held on, and she felt against her hair a shaking that he was not quite controlling, the particular trembling of a man who had just committed the bravest act of his life, which was choosing love over power, openly, irrevocably, in front of the people for whom power had been the only language. They left Seoul 6 weeks later, not because they had to. The men who had taken the empire had no further interest in either of them. The terms had been honored. What they had wasn't a death sentence anymore. But Baek Do-hyun said, on a quiet evening when Caroline was packing and he was sitting on the edge of her bed watching her, that Seoul was full of the version of him he was trying to leave behind, and that seemed like a practical reason to go somewhere else. Where? She asked. He thought about it. Where have you always wanted to go? She said, Jeju Island, actually. I saw photos of it when I was doing research before I came to Korea. It looked like somewhere that existed outside of ordinary time. He smiled, the slow one, the one that transformed his face. Then Jeju Island. They went. They found a house on the coast with a view of the sea and a garden that had space for peonies, which Caroline immediately planted, and for the first months they simply existed in the particular silence of two people relearning how to live without the pressure of a world organized around power and threat. He went to therapy, eventually. A recommendation from a doctor in Jeju City who specialized in long-term stress and complex trauma, who did not ask what the source of the stress had been and got in return a patient who attended every appointment and did the work with the same precision he'd applied to everything else. He slept better. The nightmares diminished. Something in him that had been coiled for 28 years began, slowly, reluctantly, like a fist learning to open, to relax. Caroline reopened her nursing credentials, registered through the Korean nursing equivalency process that took 4 months and considerable paperwork and resulted in a position at a community clinic in Jeju City that saw tourists and locals alike and paid a fraction of what her Chicago salary had been and felt more like herself than any work she'd done in years. She was good at it. She was very good at it. She came home in the evenings tired and satisfied, and he was there, and dinner was usually waiting because he had been cooking more since they moved and was better at it than he'd let on. They were careful with each other. That word again, but differently now. The carefulness of people who understood what the alternative looked like and chose this instead. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in April, in the garden, while she was planting more peonies, and he was ostensibly drinking coffee, but had been watching her for 20 minutes before he spoke. He did it the way he did everything, without excess. He said, I want you to be my wife, and he said it with the directness of a man who had decided to stop being careful about the things that mattered and to simply say them out loud. She sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and looked at him. Her hands were muddy. There was nothing in the moment that resembled the versions of this she'd imagined at 12 or 20 or 30. It was better than all of them. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. They were married in June. Small ceremony, Jeju Island, ocean in the background. Mrs. Kwan flew down from Seoul and cried the entire time. The clinic owner brought handmade rice cake, and Caroline's mother came from Chicago in a state of controlled bewilderment that softened over the course of 3 days into something that looked almost like approval, or at least like the particular piece of a mother watching her daughter be loved by someone who means it. That November, Caroline came home from the clinic to find him in the kitchen and stood in the doorway watching him cook, the way she'd once watched him from a careful professional distance when she was new, and he was a stranger, and neither of them knew yet what was being assembled between them. He turned around, the way he always seemed to know when she was watching, and she said, before she'd fully planned to say it, I'm pregnant. The spoon he was holding stopped moving. She watched his face. Watch the calculations and the old grief and the 28 years of a life without this arrive and then make room, all in the span of a few seconds, for something else entirely. Something that had never had a place before. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both hands on her face and looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Are you?" She was crying a little, she realized, from the relief of saying it out loud. Yes, his hands, which had once held guns and signed away empires without trembling, were shaking. Both of them, against her face. "I didn't think," he started, and stopped. "I didn't think this was something that could still happen for me." "It happened," she said. He kissed her forehead, her cheek. He held her in the kitchen while the soup went on simmering and the Jeju evening came through the windows in gold and salt air. And outside the house the peonies had long since bloomed and would bloom again in spring, and the version of Baek Do-hyun that had spent 28 years choosing power over everything else was gone, replaced entirely and irreversibly by the man standing in this kitchen with his arms around this woman, shaking with something that had no name in the language his empire had taught him. It felt like the beginning of something. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and don't miss